Hello, everyone. If you are here for a live author event with Gloria Dickie about her new book, Eight Bears, Mythic Past and Imperiled Future, you are in the right place. My name is Michael Schantz. I am the Marketing Communications Manager here at High Country News and the sort of the MC of the Summer Reading Challenge. I'm going to hand it off to Michelle Nyhouse in just a sec, our wonderful contributing editor, to chat with Gloria. But first, I just wanted to remind you that this event actually is part of our Summer Reading Challenge. If you haven't taken a moment to look at the reading challenge yet, you can just go to that URL at the bottom of the screen. It was designed to just be like one of those library summer reading programs you might be familiar with from your youth. This year it's a path, and there's reading prompts along the way, written by Michelle, our poetry editor, Paisley Recto, and actually our contributing editor for Books, Culture, and Commentary, Melissa Chadburn, as well. So 3 great people to give you fun reading nudges for the rest of the summer. And you also, at that website, can see what other people are reading. That's a really fun aspect of it as well. You can submit your own books that you're reading. You can see what other people are reading for other steps. So I'd invite you to join in, have fun. There's also the other events that we have planned for this summer as part of the reading challenge. And I think with that, I will hand it over to Michelle.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today, wherever you may be joining us from. We are very lucky today to have Gloria Dickie with us and to talk about her just launched book, Eight Bears. It grows in part out of her reporting at High Country News almost a decade ago. She's now writes about climate and the environment for Reuters. And she's here to tell us not only about the bears that we know pretty well in the West, grizzly bears and black bears, but about bears throughout the world. And I found this book just so interesting because of the ways it showed me what our bears, so to speak, have in common with bears worldwide and how they differ. These 8 bears are a pretty diverse bunch. So Gloria, welcome. And I think you're going to start us off with a short reading.
I am. Thank you for that introduction, Michelle. And yes, I'll read a little bit of a passage about kind of bears and people as I experienced it, at least. I was often struck by the leniency and grace extended toward the bears I encountered, particularly when compared with other predators. Though state wildlife agencies in North America are tasked with killing so-called problem bears, many people strive to prevent such needless death. The gruff men with leathered hands and burnished Stetsons I met in Montana would never abide wolves or coyotes. A howl on the breeze had them reaching for their gun, but bears were another matter. The distinction puzzled me. Why were bears put in a different class from other predators on the landscape? Perhaps it was because of our own social constructions. The first animal form we encounter in this world is often a bear, a cribside companion that accompanies us in our formative years. Later, in childhood, parents read bedtime stories featuring bears as fairy tale heroes, from Winnie the Pooh to the Berenstain Bears, Rupert Bear, and Paddington. By imbuing bears with a whimsical nature during infancy, had we unwittingly crafted a complicated relationship with the species. Consider the fairy tale antagonists. The big bad wolf reigns supreme in Red Riding Hood and the 3 Little Pigs, but I've yet to encounter a tale featuring a villainous bear, though brown bears likely still roam Germany's Black Forest, the ground zero of fairy tales, when the brothers Grimm were spinning their most famous yarns. In Goldilocks and the 3 Bears, arguably the most notable piece of bear folklore, our ire is not directed toward the bear family, but rather the intrusive human. Robert Southey, the English poet who wrote the first printed version in 1837, describes 3 bachelor bears, a little small wee bear, a middle-sized bear, and a great huge bear, as good-natured, trusting, harmless, and hospitable, as polite as bears can be. In contrast, Goldilocks is characterized as impudent, foul-mouthed, ugly, and dirty. Initially, he wrote her as a silver-haired old woman, though later iterations would transform her into a blonde damsel or child. This triumvirate of friendly bears is the unwitting victim of a narcissistic human who breaks into their home, eats their porridge, and splinters Wee Bear's beloved chair. Then, when all is said and done, she passes out in their bed. Our modern reality does not differ much from this fabled world. We have entered the bears' homes without permission and selfishly laid claim to what we found there. In the words of Wee Bear, someone's been lying in my bed, and, well, here we are.
Thanks, Gloria. That's great. And yeah, as you say, it's so interesting how, as dangerous as some bears are in the wrong circumstances, all of our cultural messages, almost all of them, present bears as allies and benevolent characters of our childhood.
Yeah, that juxtaposition always really appealed to me because kind of in terms of bear media, for adults, we do have like, these vicious killer bears. On the one hand, people want to read about bear attacks, but on the other hand, childhood, they're like these little fairy tale protagonists that, are friends to us versus it's a very split worldview between there's like no middle ground of what a bear is.
Yeah, it's so culturally interesting. So tell you write about growing up in Canada and how you didn't get to see many bears despite being up in the Great North, and that your interest in bears really developed when you came to Colorado for graduate school and then to work at High Country News. So what got you started reporting on bears and what kept you writing about them?
Yeah, so I moved to Boulder in 2013, and it was kind of a time when bear-human conflicts were peaking in Boulder over trash in the alleyways. Bears were coming down from the mountains. Boulder's right against the Front Range, and they were, eating to their heart's content. And then they were falling asleep, near schoolyards and cemeteries, near people. And so Colorado Parks and Wildlife was killing a lot of bears. And I remember thinking like, oh, it's weird that Boulder doesn't have like bear-proof garbage bins. Because I'd seen those up near Banff National Park. I'd seen this, all over Canada in different areas. And I was like, oh, it's weird Boulder doesn't have that. And that same year, there was a group of citizens who were trying to push Boulder to adopt that kind of bylaw. And they did. And that was kind of like, so I did my master's project looking at bears and people across the American West over trash. And then I went to High Country News and reported on the Yellowstone grizzly being pushes for the grizzly to be removed from ESA protections. And then I think I just learned there were 8 bears total and started following bears around the world.
So you write really evocatively, as in part as we were just talking about the cultural connection that we have with bears, and also this, not just that we love and admire fictional bears and live bears to some extent, but that we almost see them as relatives, as partly human. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, for a really long time, people thought that bears and humans were actually kind of close relatives, like how we view primates and humans today. And there's several different plugins, I think, to that. There were a lot of indigenous mythologies that said that bears and people were kind of shapeshifters and they could move between the two forms. I think Aristotle and Pliny the Elder, they would talk about how similar bears and people were. The bear expressed curiosity, kind of like humans do. And then there are some of the sort of physiological attributes. Bears can walk on 2 legs, which is not too common for most animals. They're not permanent, bipeds, but they can raise up and kind of walk like that. We had talked before this as well, that when some people observe that when bears are skinned and their fur is removed, they look like humans underneath their fur, which is kind of creepy. And you had a good anecdote about that. And then also too, just the bear's footprint is remarkably similar to the human's footprint. I remember walking once in the woods here in Boulder, and I saw it looked like it was a wet human footprint, but I looked a little bit closer. I'm like, no, that's a bear footprint that had been left on a rock. But it's amazing how similar some of those physical attributes are.
Yeah, it's really, I don't think about those parallels very much, but it's so true. Because they seem so different at first glance. They seem like very different beings, but there are a lot of parallels. We were talking before we came on about, if those of you who have visited the Paonia office of High Country News over the years might remember that there was once a packing shed, a meat packing shed next door, and we got pretty used to seeing different kinds of meat hung on a hook in the back of the building, but every once in a while there would be a bear, and you would always do a double take because it does look quite human without its skin. And it made me realize where all those fairy tales of women who turned into bears and bears who turned into women came from. So I think most people listening are going to be tuning in from the West, where we do think about grizzly bears and brown bears and black bears quite a bit. One of the things that I really admire about your book, and I thought you did so cleverly, I should say, is that you write about these 8 bears and we get to know them very well, but you, in each chapter, you bring out a deeper issue that they are facing. Some bears are dealing with illegal trafficking of bear bile, for instance. Some bears are dealing with habitat loss. Some bears are dealing with climate change. And the bears in our region are really dealing with coexistence or the lack of coexistence. We're lucky in that our numbers of bears are multiplying, but we are living where they want to be in some cases. So what has our region learned about living with bears, black bears and grizzly bears?
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, I think that the black bears and the grizzly bear, they're the two kind of success stories in some ways in the book. But I write that, we are kind of reaching this tipping point where, especially in the case of grizzly bears around Yellowstone and things like that, people are kind of like, do we have enough bears? Do we want more than this? And what would that look like? And, can we even live with how many are currently here, which is about 1,000 in the Yellowstone ecosystem? And, I had scientists kind of refer to black bears as like the training wheel bears to me. They're like, we have to learn to live to coexist with black bears at least, because, we're going to have to coexist with more brown bears if we're going to make room for them. And so I kind of spoke with scientists, I spoke with ranchers, I spoke with trophy hunters, kind of all the different stakeholders over, how many bears do you want? How many grizzly bears do you want here? And it was really interesting to hear the range of opinions. And I don't think that we figured out coexistence yet. And I think, especially with continued pushes, by the government to remove protections from the Yellowstone bears and the ones up near Glacier as well, I think that no one really quite knows, do we want more or less bears at this point? Or are we happy where we're at? But we have seen, tactics like buying conservation easements around parks to prevent conflicts with cattle. There's predator payout programs to try and boost tolerance among the ranching community. But and as is a very familiar sentiment in the West, is there are people who live in that landscape. They don't really want people who live in cities away from grizzly bears to tell them what to do, right? Because they don't have to live with this kind of apex predator next door. So I think that's a really important viewpoint as well to consider. But yeah, for now it's just, if we can't even secure our trash to deal with black bears, like how do we deal with grizzly bears next door?
Right. Yeah. As you say, black bears are kind of training wheel bears. But I suppose it sounds like in Yosemite, there has been quite a bit of progress.
Yosemite has had a progress because they had such like anti-progress for so long.
That's a horrible problem that they had to deal with it.
Yes. Did you want me to talk? I can give a quick background about what Yosemite looked like.
How that's because I'm some people may not know that there has been some positive change there.
Yeah. I mean, even up until the 90s, like there was an article that I quote in my book from the San Francisco Chronicle where it was like, there was a time when visiting Yosemite was descending into bear mayhem because like there were just so many of these marauding, black bears in the park breaking into cars, thousands of vehicle break-ins, hundreds of thousands of dollars in damage from bears, and attacks on people and bears being killed as well. But all of that begins with Yosemite had tried to basically create kind of tourism around bear feeding and bears at dumps back in the early 20th century, where people would come in and they'd either sit in their car and watch the bears, feeding in the dump. There was a landfill that was like in the park itself. Or they would have bleachers in some cases, set up around where the bears were. And they just became so addicted to human food and human garbage that they would no longer eat natural foods, and they became very bold and a bit aggressive towards people. And so it's taken Yosemite nearly 100 years to try and deal with that problem, and they have now. They're doing really well. So, but they had to wait for that kind of generation of trash addicted bears to die out, or they had to remove them from the population.
Right. It takes a while. They're smart, right? So
incredibly smart. Yeah.
Yeah, and so they pass on this great food source, and it takes a while for a population to unlearn that.
Yeah.
And now, so grizzly bears, as you say, grizzly bears are a different level a whole different, level of risk and so forth, in terms of coexistence. Tell us about the prospects there. I mean, and I should say, people, if you haven't already, please do check out the excerpt from Gloria's book that's on hcn.org right now. It's a chapter from the book that does talk about grizzlies and the problems of, so to speak, success. What do we do when these populations start to reconnect on private land near where people live?
Yeah, I think those are the two big issues facing, the next kind of discussion points. I think the next couple of decades will be, will we see, right now, grizzly bears exist in isolated population fragments throughout the lower 48, and there's 6 kind of recovery areas that have been identified. And so one of the questions is, will we see these populations connect and begin breeding together? The bears between Yellowstone and the Northern Continental Divide are super close right now. It's only a few hundred miles, I think, if that, between them meeting and finally connecting for the first time in, over a century. But there's roads in between, there's ranches in between, there's people in between. So it's really going to have to take a high degree of tolerance and us being willing to make space for bears for them to be able to do that and not just have it be a one-off incident, but for these two populations to kind of reconnect, which is actually really beautiful, I think, to think about how long it's taken them to find their way back to each other without humans, even dropping more bears in. But that's the second question, which is, will we reintroduce grizzly bears to areas where they've been gone? And the area where we're seeing that making the most kind of progress is the North Cascades. And I did travel to the North Cascades for the book. It ended up took out during edits when they're trying to trim length. But I want to speak with people who live there because the North Cascade is pretty progressive when it comes to environmental issues. A lot of the communities there, they kind of, they're environmentally friendly communities, but at the same time, recreationalists are quite concerned about having to live with grizzly bears if they come back. It's the people who are hiking and mountain biking and camping who are like, I love bears, but I'm afraid of that, and I think it will be a really interesting test case if they do. I mean, it's a kind of ping-ponging back and forth every year as to whether or not they're going to put bears in there again. But if they do, it'll be a really interesting, I think, test case for the future of bears.
Yeah, that's been under discussion for a long time. And as you say, yeah, it continues to ping pong back and forth. Did you ask people about or notice any difference in their attitudes between wolves, which are back now in the Northwest, and grizzly bears? Do people feel differently about living next to wolves than they do living next to grizzly bears?
Absolutely. And that's, I did some stories for High Country News about wolf payouts and wolf, and some of this was informed actually by that High Country News story too, because I would ask people about wolves. And they were just, they hated wolves. Like they saw them as demons, they're not even like deserving of life. And you ask them about grizzly bears and they're like, yeah, they're a bit, but they're like, oh, they're so cool. Like this one time I saw a grizzly bear and it was doing this. And
that's the opposite of what I was expecting, actually.
No, I've met so many ranchers. I mean, even like the trophy hunters. I mean, like I interviewed a trophy hunter in the book and he loved bears. Like he just thought they were the coolest thing. But yeah, and there's a bunch of ranchers who are kind of part of this progressive environmental movement who in kind of Wyoming and Montana who, they're big into grizzly conservation. There was one ranch that I actually visited for High Country News in 2015. And they had they had cattle, but they had like 20 grizzly bears that would come in and eat like wild carrot root on the ranch, and they would just leave them there. They're like, oh, the bears are here, move the cows and we'll let them go eat in the field, just digging up roots and stuff. So it was fascinating to me.
That's really interesting. So in the time we have left, I want to ask about 2 other bears, one which people probably at least think a lot about, and one which they may not know very much about. That one is the sloth bear in India, which I had read a little bit about, but I didn't realize just quite how dangerous it can be to people. I think you describe it, not that it's necessarily just aggressive for no reason, but you say it has a very low throttle point. Mm-hmm. It can be extremely easily provoked, unintentionally provoked. So, and so, please talk about coexistence with a species that truly is the cause of a lot of horrible injuries and deaths.
Yeah, I mean, the sloth bear makes it seem like the people living in the American West have it pretty easy, I think. So yeah, I mean, the sloth bear it's a very kind of irascible bear. It also is partially, it attacks and kills a lot of people because people live so close to it. There's millions of people who are in these rural villages. The sloth bear is a pretty tiny bear. It's like 250 pounds. He's not very big. But typically people will be out in the woods. They'll be gathering mushrooms or tendu leaves, which they create cigarettes out of. And they'll be kind of like looking down, and the bear is coming the same way, looking down, snuffling along the forest floor, and it, gets surprised and it, just completely, viciously mauls these people. And there's a lot of deaths. And the government doesn't typically kill. I mean, this is very different from like the North American wildlife model, where if like a bear so much as swipes at someone's pet dog, they'll kill it. In India, the government doesn't really like kill problem animals unless they're like, sometimes you have like these man-eaters that go on these, kind of rampages.
Mm-hmm.
But the default action is not just to go out and kill the bear. However, we do see revenge killings by local villages and tribes who will find a bear and they'll beat it to death or they'll electrocute it. And there's concern that because these conflicts are so high and this bear is also threatened with extinction, if you're having these conflicts and people are killing enough of the bears out of fear and revenge, well, eventually you have a population impact on a threatened species. So yeah, and I think the sloth bear, I think it's the least known bear. Everyone I try to get to name the 8 bears, no one ever knows. They've never heard of this bear.
Yeah. I'm sure you never forget it if you've encountered it. Are there alternatives? I mean, is it not? I'm sure there are not easy alternatives, but is it a problem of habitat, as you say, where there's just more space?
One of the big conservation challenges in India is you have so many charismatic animals. And of course, the sloth bear lives typically where tigers live. So in the areas where those two animals overlap, one, they don't get along. So the sloth bear doesn't want to share habitat with tigers. But the other issue is that the government is largely protecting protected areas with the tiger in mind. So they're trying to make sure that the tiger has enough food and habitat and that it can kind of enjoy this luxurious lifestyle at the center of protected areas. But the sloth bear is pushed out because it's afraid of the tigers. It doesn't want its cubs there. So it's in the periphery, which is where people are as well. So we're kind of protecting tigers at the cost of some of these other animals by pushing them into more conflict. And that's what scientists think. But it was really interesting because I then went to Gujarat, which is in Western India, and there aren't any tigers in Gujarat. And the sloth bear has way more prominence in terms of conservation. Like they have protected areas just for the sloth bear, where they're putting termites in, they're putting water in to make sure that it stays, that it has a nice habitat, so it's not attacking people, right? It's two very different visions of what conservation can look like. So, yeah.
It benefits from being the only game in town, so to speak, or the only predator in town.
Yeah.
So, which brings us to your favorite bear, and a bear that I think, at least in North America, I've heard a lot about because of its association with climate change, even if we may not have had the chance to see it in person as you did. So, tell us a little bit about your adventures with polar bears.
Of course, yes. Yeah, so the polar bear, its population is currently doing okay, which I think people are always surprised about. But the concern, of course, is that polar bears are, kind of chugging along to this cliff where once climate change and the melting sea ice, once the sea ice is gone, the bear can no longer hunt. So they will go extinct. And I traveled to Churchill, Manitoba, which is one of the easiest places to see bears. It's one of the cheapest places to get to as a journalist to see bears. But they have around 600 polar bears that migrate through each year. And it's also... it's one of the lowest latitude locations where polar bears live. So as things warm up and as the ice disappears, those lower latitude populations will be the first to go extinct locally. And scientists think that the bears around Western Hudson Bay and around Churchill, by 2060, 2070, we could really start to see, severe impacts on the population there. And indeed, we've already seen about a 40% decline since the 1980s in the bears that live there. And there's a study that was done a couple of years ago where they kind of found that across the Arctic, only a very few polar bear populations in the very high Arctic will persist beyond 2100. So we're looking at extinction for a bear, and we're looking at it, quite soon, I think, which even surprised me. In our lifetime, we will see these bears gone from certain areas.
Yeah. So many of these bears that you write about are so close to the edge, and which is so poignant because, as we've talked about, they have such a long association with humans, if mostly from a distance, and they're such large animals. They're such keystones in their ecosystems.
And that's why they require a lot of space, right? They're big animals, and they're some of the smaller ones they can do with less habitat, but with bears, we need to make a lot of room for them. So it's tricky.
Yeah. What are some of the things that you learned from this project? You got to travel all over the world to bear habitat in every corner of the world. what are some of the things that surprised you?
Yeah, I mean, I learned a lot. I don't think that I knew very much about the world's other lesser known bear species before this. I remember seeing a documentary when I was a kid about bear bile and being kind of upset by that. But I think, the spectacled bear and the sloth bear, I don't think that I, knew much about their kind of story in this world. One of the things that I was surprised about was I think that we think of bears as being very kind of European and like North American culturally. I think it's fascinating that, there's bears in the tropical forests of, Borneo and below the equator in South America, and like just habitat that you wouldn't think a bear would live in, the cloud forests of Peru and Ecuador. It's like these incredibly lush, dense forests with the clouds floating through and watering the plants. And there's these, little spectacled bears that are up in the canopy making little nests out of branches and eating avocados. And
Which sounds so cute, by the way.
and they're nice bears too. They don't attack people, so they're very docile. But yeah, I just think the sheer diversity of bears and the fact that so many are threatened by distinct but often overlapping environmental issues. So yeah, that's kind of and I think, and as I kind of conclude that, I think we'll have, 3 bears are kind of in a good spot right now. And I think it's the brown bear, of which the grizzly is a subspecies, the American black bear, which is the most plentiful bear globally, and the panda bear, which is the least plentiful bear globally. But the government of China has put so much time and money into their conservation that I think I don't think they're going to go extinct. I don't think that China would let that happen. So, right. But for the other 5, I think it's a challenge of what lies ahead.
Yeah, it really is. Well, thank you, Gloria. You write about all 8 bears beautifully, and I really recommend that people pick up the book. Let me put it in front of the camera, which I always do.
We can do double copy. There you go, mirror copies.
2 of the 8. And I was telling you before we came on, it's a book that has a lot of heavy subjects in it. Of course, I mean, these are not easy things to read about, but you tell the stories of these bears so compellingly and with so much vivid detail that I do not hesitate to recommend it as a vacation book. You can also then entertain your family with bear facts as you travel. So please do pick it up or request it at your library, and check out, there's a link in the chat to Gloria's excerpt in High Country News, which you can take a look at to get a taste of what the rest of the book is about. Yes, and there is a link to buy the book should you choose to do so, which I encourage you to do. Gloria, thank you so much. Thanks for being part of the High Country News community and for bringing us this wonderful book.
Thank you so much, Michelle. It was a pleasure to talk to you about these issues.
Thanks so much to everyone for joining us today, and enjoy 8 Bears and the rest of your summer reading.
Bye.
Here, Gloria.